Fáilte gach duine. Thank you very much for coming, everybody. I am Ismisha Sean O'Hulacan. Now, what that means is I am either Shane or John Holland. John P. actually officially on my birth cert. So when I found out that I had some links to John P. Holland, the guy from County Clare, I was aware that he was a person, and I was aware that he was an inventor, and the fact that I was an industrial designer as well, there was a kind of a link which I didn't think was as close as it could be. So I'm not, I'm not a super close relative, but having the exact same name, or well, he was John Philip Holland, I'm John Patrick Holland, and I'm going to tell you about all the Johns in the Holland setup because there's a lot of them. So anyway, I suppose the stories of the Submarinocurraplane, as Mike said, Submarinocurraplane is actually a sculpture which I did a few years ago in 2023, or last year, and that kind of was maybe me going down a rabbit hole of trying to link things together. So the reason that there's a currach outside will become more apparent as we go through it. So this story is about famine, Fenians, failure, the Christian Brothers. I'm looking at maybe some of you out here know about the Christian Brothers. Any hands up on that one? Okay, they were over here too. So it was not a particularly easy place to go to school, I'd imagine, but John P. Holland was a Christian brother for a lot of it, and he was a teacher. Just like my parents are both teachers, so everything starts clicking into place where we're going. This is getting kind of a bit weird. Invention was a thing which obviously he was always working on designs and he was sketching things, and before he came to America he had sets of drawings, he had sets of sketches about, submarine craft, aviation, submersible ducks, all of that kind of stuff. And his life story, I'd like to go through the history in his family and the history of him in the early years in Ireland first. So, everything is kind of linked, whether it's in Cork, Clare, Boston, New York, New Jersey, or New London. The Holland story is quite a thing. He got around. So obviously that's a fairly famous picture of John Philip, and he's there in his Holland submarine, and this was him probably at the peak of his powers. This is kind of a slide of my Submarinocurraplane, but I'm going to get to the earlier years. So everybody says that John P. Holland was from a little place called Liscannor, which is kind of beside a place called Lahinch, which is well known to surfers at the moment, and close enough to Ennistymon in West County Clare. If you know the Cliffs of Moher, if you've ever been to Ireland, it's a pretty spectacular place, and most people get to go there. So he's just around the corner from the Cliffs of Moher. But the interesting thing about his dad was that his dad was a part of the Coast Guard, and his dad, if anybody knows anything about Coast Guard or police or anybody, they're not supposed to be from the neighborhood that they're guarding. They're supposed to be out-of-towners. So where did he come from? So John Holland Sr., yes, it was another John. He came from around the Bantry area, and that's in West Cork. You can see you've Kerry up here, you've West Cork. It's a pretty wild place, and it's a pretty wild kind of mountainous area. West Cork was known as the Rebel County, and I suppose this was kind of before the War of Independence, because we're back in the 1830s, and we're talking about John Holland Sr. was actually working for, let's call it Crown Forces or whatever. He was a part of the whole British apparatus, but it seemed with the famine and everything that the family were certainly not big fans of the British Empire by the time it came to them having to move out of their home. They did get a little cottage, number 3 Castle Street, and they did get a place where they could go to. So again, as I say about the name Holland, it sounds very Dutch and it sounds very kind of not Irish, but actually when you dig in, it's spelt like this, O'Hualacán. Now, O'Hualacán is a part of a whole gene pool of many other Irish names, Holahans, Hoolahans, Whalahans, Holahans. There's a whole bunch of Irish people that are linked to it. And then if you wanted to just translate it into Irish, it's O'Hualacán. Now, if you know anything about the Celtic revival and whatever, there was a lady called Kathleen Ní Hualacán, who was essentially the embodiment of Ireland. She was also known as the Shanban Bucht, and she was the kind of downtrodden woman who essentially got Irish young men to kind of fight for Ireland against the British. So this is getting much more politicized here, but how tossed, how lost, with hopes all crossed. We long have been, our gold is gone, gear we have none, as all have seen, but ships shall brave the ocean wave, and morn shall dawn on Erin's green, O Kathleen Ní Hualacán. So that's one of the poems that was written with Kathleen Ní Hualacán as the kind of embodiment of Ireland, and it was very much a revolutionary or a kind of Republican calling card before, way back when it was the Fenians and the Irish Republican Brotherhood. But, poems and our literature were really the things that kind of stoked everybody. And, it was anglicised to Holland because it was just a simpler thing. In the old days, you used to have to put your name on a cart, and I think the British were probably going, oh, come on, that name is too much for me. We're just going to go Holland here on this one. So that's kind of what happened with the Hollands. They were O'Hualacáns, but they went here. Now I'm going to show you what Liscannor looked like in 1841. That's not a pretty place in some ways because it looks pretty tough. But as you can see, people had to eke out a pretty rough existence in Liscannor, and there were thatched cottages, and maybe these were the Coast Guard's kind of towers to kind of look out for pirates and various people who might have been, doing moonshine or doing whatever to make a living. But you can see the curraghs on the beach, which were basically to feed the people, and they were a part of the furniture in terms of what people were used to seeing in Liscannor. So he would have got a cottage at least. But as I was saying here, his life was tough, but not as bad as others. But what he saw during famine and evictions, starvation, cholera, it led him and his brother to resent British rule despite their father's occupation or as an outwardly loyalist job. He moved in 1858 to Limerick, which is kind of the not so big city, but at 17. And then he joined the Christian Brothers and was given an engagement in Cork, the city that we have back here. So Cork City is the kind of capital of Munster, but it was over here. He was in a very famous school called the North Mon, which was like the North Monastery, and that was the Christian Brothers. And they had a very good kind of science and education program, and they had a very good encouragement of people to go to sea. So there was a specific brother who was there who was kind of saying, oh, what would you like to do? And even in Limerick, he was saying he'd like to go to sea, but his eyesight was so bad, they didn't really want him at sea. So they were going, okay, forget about the sea, just become a teacher. And that was his kind of early life. So he was basically coming out of poverty, I suppose, or maybe not as bad poverty as the regular folks in Liscannor, and then moved to Cork after being in Limerick. And eventually the Christian Brothers transferred him over. I think he did one or two other assignments in Enniscorthy and in Portlaoise, but he moved to Drogheda on the east coast. And in 1865, he'd already made sketches and experiments in aviation and submarines. And the thing about Drogheda is that's the town where I was born. So I think this whole tracking each other kind of thing just keeps on popping up. So, that's on the east coast, and it's about 30 miles, 40 miles north of Dublin. So he emigrated, he went to Dundalk, which is another port town north of Drogheda, and he went to Liverpool in 1873 and left the Christian Brothers and said, let's try America. So he went straight to Boston in third-class steerage, and he had kind of left the bosom of the Christian Brothers, which was kind of like a, there was a certain security there, but he felt that he could do better by coming to the United States. And I can't argue with that. Now I'm going to show you, guess who's the little boy in the dress? So that's me in 1969. I am 57 now, but there is a story about fairies stealing children, and there was a kind of a thing where boys got dressed up as girls to avoid that happening. So you can see what my mother put me in order to avoid that. But she was tough enough to say to my father, when they called me John Patrick Holland and he was John Joseph Holland, my dad is John Joseph Holland, my mother said, listen, I'm not having this John business anymore, we're going to call him Shane. So, I had to apply to get Shane applied to my passport because I'm really John P, but this carried on throughout our history where there was a John Holland here, then there was another John Holland here, and every now and again they put a William in, but they were from West Cork. And we're linked with Crowleys and Murphys and whatever. So in our particular division of the Hollands, I suppose West Cork was the whole family, kind of the clan came from West Cork, and Clare people were always going, oh, John Holland is a Clare man. And of course, this fella called Mike Holland came into my workshop just before COVID and said, which Hollands are ye? And that's usually, we had an incident in the bar last night where in Albany we met another John Holland, and I was going, well, which Hollands are ye? And he was going, and what have you got? Well, I've got a John and we've got a William in there as well. So it's a thing that just keeps popping up. So that was, there was another one to, my younger sister wasn't alive then, but both of my parents were teachers and they were linked with agriculture. But my grandfather was William Holland, and he was I'm going to see whether he's on this. I'll talk about the grandfather again, but he was a pretty tough guy as well, and he's kind of later on when the Irish War of Independence starts. So we'll go back to the William Sonny Holland later, but we want to get on to what was kind of inspiring John P. Holland to go to America and what was going on in his head. And of course, he was watching things like maybe Jules Verne and reading stories about submarine travel and, getting buzzed by all this kind of stuff, And then he was also reading about the American Civil War and the ironclads. And I think there was there was the Monitor, and there was various ironclads that were shooting at each other down in Charlestown Bay. And he was reading about this kind of stuff in the papers back home before he came out. So that was kind of getting him worked up about drawing and designing submarines. So again, these things were like almost fully submerged, and you're going like, let's minimize the target here for people to shoot at, but have a big reinforced kind of turret that we can shoot at the other side. So the Confederates were getting, they were shooting at each other anyway, and it was a thing that was exercising Holland in his kind of search for inspiration, or where can I fit in with this whole moving to a new country. Now, his brother Michael was already kind of getting into trouble back in Limerick with saying he was a separationist, so he wasn't for the British Union, and he was writing pamphlets in Limerick, so he had to get out of town and go to Boston, and he had gone to America before the brother. So Holland went over to the brother Michael in Boston, but he slipped on ice and broke his leg the minute he got there. So that wasn't a great start, but in his recuperation, it allowed him time to kind of review his early submarine designs and even his aviation sketches. And he started, that few months of just sitting in a bed was actually helpful. So Anyway, he didn't stay in Boston for too long, but he moved down to Paterson. I'm sorry about all this. I didn't realize this is not edited as well as I could have it. But he kind of went back to the mothership and started doing the Christian Brothers again. They encouraged him to go back to teaching, and a parent from one of the schools in Paterson, New Jersey. So he ended up down in Paterson, New Jersey, and one of the parents was saying, "You're the guy that does them sketches. Surely you should send these into the Navy." So he was going, well. The response was unencouraging. Whatever he sent, the early designs he sent into the Navy, they were going, "Oh man, who are you? You're just a teacher. You haven't a clue." But Holland was kind of smart because he was going, I didn't really give him the full deck of cards here. I just kind of stuck it in to see what was going to happen. But in the Fenian Brotherhood in America, the Catalpa Rescue, I don't know if anybody's ever heard of the Catalpa Rescue. Fremantle, Australia, there was a bunch of Fenian prisoners that were locked up in Western Australia, and then there was a boat out of New Haven, I think, which was a whaling boat, and it kind of pretended to be whaling, but it was actually going to rescue the guys. And they did a big rescue, and it was like a big success. And they came back. They got a smaller boat out to the big whaling boat and came back to America as heroes. And I think it was John Breslin and John Devoy were the two people that were in the Irish Republican Brotherhood that basically started linking up with Holland. His brother Michael introduced him to Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa, and then John Breslin, and they started talking to this professor about what way could we mess up the Royal Navy. So this was kind of the next step for him to try to bring his invention career to the fore. So this was probably these were the first sketches. You can kind of see there was like one guy in there with a little treadle, and there was no motor. And these were some of the early sketches. The Navy were not interested in these, and they were sort of idealized drawings which were rejected. So the whole rejection thing and failure thing is also a common theme, whether it's the Irish political theme of continually failing to get things done in terms of Irish freedom, but this 12-foot treadle-operated propeller was just the start. The Fenian Ram, as it was called, was the project. I think it was called the Skirmishing Fund, was the thing which was to all of the workers that were putting in their dollars and their nickels into this fund that was requested in order to carry on from that Catalpa kind of victory, was really to get the idea of sinking Royal Navy ships. And he started the Fenian Ram 1879, 1883. It was the most viable solution, and it was demonstrated in the Passaic River in Paterson to mixed results. But finally, to cut the long story short, it was a long story. He was over and back. Things might have been running over budget. He was looking for money. They said no. They stole the boat off him, and it kind of soured. In the end, the Fenians kind of stole the working prototype, and they kind of left a hatch open, or something happened, and it sank. So the Fenian Ram ended up at the bottom of the Passaic River, or it was at the bottom of a dock in New Jersey or New York, and that was kind of the end of that relationship. It was an actual very viable thing, and he was getting encouraged by it. But the relationship with the Fenians kind of broke down. So that was Holland's second boat, which was pretty impressive, and had a pneumatic gun, and was launched in 1883 and funded by the IRB in Clonagale. So second boat is in Paterson, New Jersey, where I'm going tomorrow. I'm really excited to see these boats. And Jim Gallagher that was there showing me the pictures that he's taken in Paterson. So we were going to see whether there were any other relations down there. I think there were Scanlons and Foleys, and there weren't many Hollands, but I haven't met any. I've been doing better meeting people up in Albany who have the Holland name, but there's still no shortage. So anyway, the story goes on that Holland goes on to produce boats 3, 4, 5, and it ends up the one he's getting out of in that famous hatch. The whole story goes on to the Holland Torpedo Boat Company in Broadway, New York, and you can see tough bunch of guys there who are all, helping build these boats. And the Holland 6, I suppose, became the boat, really, that everybody, it's a long story short, and I'm not the Holland history expert, but it went on to Holland 6, and when I was down in the museum there today, we see the SS-1, which seems to be the first US naval submarine. So that's the tiny little one on the little models, but that was the one where all of the hydrodynamics and all of the things started to align and to become a viable submarine, which went on to become produced. And I think there were 6 boats, I think, produced. The Moccasin, there was the Holland, there was a number of different ones which became the kind of production model for the first viable submarines that were commercially available. And the company, which was the Torpedo Boat Company, kind of went through various changes in management and changes in stock ownership. And really the bottom line was that Holland became less important to the company than he was more the figurehead, but he was kind of, when things were going well and they thought they were going to get a contract from the US government, he started off getting maybe $100 a week, and then it went down to 40 or 50, and he wasn't the best businessman in the world. And that's another maybe family trait, but anyway, we won't talk about that. In terms of, he still was the figurehead, and he was probably quite a famous man at that stage in the newspapers. But there was this, 22-inch gun at the front. There was various testings going on, and all the big brass from Annapolis were kind of coming up, and he had gone through the Plunger, the Zelensky boat. There was a lot of other kind of nearly runs, which kind of got bogged down with the Navy constantly changing the specification, and they wanted steam engines in the boat rather than, petroleum or diesel models. And there was, in the end, I think the Holland 6 was the most refined. But as with every inventor, they probably went, oh, well, Holland was just never happy with whatever he did. It was like, I always want to make a better boat. I want to go again. And I think his backers just got, they got peeved with the whole inventor diva kind of thing and said, well, we're not going to, we're just going to get out and sell this boat. So they sold it to the US Navy, and I think that's when the Electric Boat Company kind of came into the plan. And I think, as we know from New London now, we have the Electric Boat Company out here a mile out the road, and we have, a lot of history that has come to New London via Holland. And then the rest of the story, you guys know a lot more about it than I do. But the most interesting thing was there was always very much tension between Holland and the Navy. The US Navy were always asking, and I think when I looked at Jim's original presentation here about the whole Holland story, it was entitled No Deck to Strut On. And as you can see, all the the important guys wanted to be standing around on a deck, usually with a perimeter around it and going, can we march up and down the deck? And that was they were saying the Navy hated submarines because they didn't have a big enough deck to walk around on. So it was a kind of a, there was constantly tension going on there, and it was a thing. But he actually ended up being sent to Europe, sent to the Dutch Navy, and he was sent back to Ireland, and he was even sent to Britain, even though this was the last thing he wanted to do. But he was now down to various I suppose, low levels of stock. So he was not as important in the business end of it, and he was told, okay, you're just a manager and you're going to do this. And I think he resigned from the torpedo boat company and said, okay, I'm going to take my chances to continue to design things. So he ended up designing kind of boats that went to the Japanese Navy, and he went to, he found them a much more down-to-earth kind of crowd, that the two officers from the Japanese Navy came and they'd strip off their clothes and get into the submarine and go, well, how does this happen? Rather than sending them letters saying, you should have X amount of horsepower and you should have steam engines in the boat. So the reason that there was 4, 5, and 6 that weren't so maybe effective, it was a thing. But this was kind of like the space race in terms of there were people who were, there was Bauer, who was from an Austrian cavalryman. There was there was Lake. There was a lot of competitors that were all hustling for the same action, the same order from the Navy. So it took about 7 years. But I'm going to come back to the kind of inspiration end of things here, because if you look at the shape of these, in County Clare they call them canoes, but you can see that it was such a thin membrane of skin over the frame that it was like using the minimal amount of material to create these hydrodynamic shapes. So, what he grew up with were these kind of very slick boats that were actually helped by the Coast Guard. So the Coast Guard in Ireland, because they moved up and down the coast, just like his father, they might have said, oh, well, instead of using animal skins, which was originally 2,000 years ago, they ended up using calico and tar and bitumen to create that highly buoyant structure. So the sculpture that I did has this, similar to the currach out there at the front, we have the same lattice work to protect the skin. And again, there were pictures of welders welding onto the skin of a submarine. It's all the same principle. So as a designer, I was going, this is interesting. And then I was actually thinking, well, there's a lot of similarities between aviation structures and the way that, an airplane is usually a tube with lots of ring structures. And so that all of these boats are part of the inspiration and a part of the thinking in an inventor's mind. So this became a piece that was basically recycled from a Boeing 707. So I got hold of a Boeing 707 back in one of the recycling places beside my workshop, phoned me one day and said, okay, Shane, we know you're into weird stuff, and we know that there's a truckload of Boeing stuff being tipped out in the yard. Can you come down? And I got an Aer Lingus pilot to come down, Kevin O'Sullivan, who was like, Kevin, what are we looking at here? And he says, well, that's a Boeing 707 getting tipped out into the yard. And we took, pieces of it, aluminium, titanium. I didn't really know what I was going to do, but when I started, maybe a year or two later, started assembling it, I started to think, wow, this is beginning to look like a submarine. And then the guy who had just come into the workshop maybe 2 or 3 months earlier, saying you're related to the submarine guy, it was beginning to fall into place. So, this whole theme of putting either recycled elements or even the fake kind of portholes that Jules Verne might have had in his submarine, where you can look out and enjoy it, more like a cruise liner than the poor US Navy guys have nothing to look out on. They're in a windowless thing. I said, well, yeah, let's add some windows. So that was a thing. So the structures, in terms of all the ribs in submarines, I said, well, it's actually very similar to the way the hull is designed in currachs. Now, where is it going? It's kind of going. So that was actually the design of the Holland 6, and it obviously shows that if you haven't succeeded on Holland 1, 2, or 3, keep going. He got to 6, and then it was kind of like beginning to work for him. So I'm not really going to go too much more on the submarine thing, but just explain some of the things. So this is Holland back in Drogheda on the Boyne. So this is kind of when he came back to Britain and Ireland on a kind of a It wasn't a cruise because he was supposed to be selling submarines, but he went back to Dundalk, and then he went back to Drogheda, this is a Boyne Currach. So Boyne Currach is actually, this is the River Boyne here. So you can see this is Teddy here, my friend, pride of place in our currach on the Boyne. So this is what we do this year, last year with the Currachine and Skerry. We're building our own boats, and we're also on the Boyne, which is the same river as Holland was on. And this was kind of like a 6-foot riverboat thing. You could cast your nets, you could do salmon fishing, legally or illegally, depends, whatever. But a French photographer took him doing it. So it was obvious by this photograph that he was obviously inspired by Irish Currachs. So this is the thing. And then how did we get inspired by Irish Currachs, and why do we want to do it? And this is part of the, this slide here is actually part of the Boeing end of things, just to show you where the bits that I got were. But that bit there, which I think that's a very old Boeing 707, but these were the kind of the liners. I think it was 1950s to 1980s. These were on the go, and that's the exploded view. So again, the similar structures. So I ended up using that piece as the kind of inspiration for this piece, which is, the piece that we've exhibited in Dublin. I wasn't really sure whether to bring it with me today, because it costs about $5,000 to get it across the Atlantic and all that kind of palaver. So Mike Connors just said, "Hey Shane, why don't you just come over and talk about it?" And I said, it's easier to show it as a slide rather than, bring it through customs. So that was the piece that kind of was my reaction to, the ancestors. And it was, it's pretty beaten up, but it was, titanium. This had probably done a few million miles, I'd say. And it was great to just get hold of this kind of technology, because all of the riveting, all of that stuff. But again, the shapes were the things that really got me. So these tough guys here hanging out on the US Porpoise and USS Shark, 1903. Again, it was quite short and stubby compared to what they've got right now. But again, they were pretty brave to go down in those things as well. And I think it ended up that and Fred was asking me, I think, what happened with them? How did the British get hold of this submarine when Holland was such a republican? And I was going, well, it doesn't always work out in business the way you want it, was the kind of thing. And he was sent over to sell it, but I think there were some other representatives in different countries that were trying to sell to the Russians, to the Germans, to pretty much everybody. The French typically had their own designer and they weren't going to buy off anybody else. The Spanish-American War was probably a good thing in terms of the development of submarines, because I think it was 1899 or something that there was a warship outside New York Harbor, and I think Holland had offered to the government. I said, I'll go down there myself and I'll sink a few of them, to promote his designs. But in the end, he really didn't have much stock or much control of the company at that stage, and it was kind of out beyond his control. So that's the kind of piece that I did in my workshop, which is just it in its normal thing. And I just want to go through and show you some of my work and what I'm doing these days in Duleek, which is just beside Drogheda. So as you can see, this is it in the Botanic Gardens in Dublin. The whole idea was kind of back to that Jules Verne thing of it hanging up in vegetation, almost looking like, underwater seaweed and, that kind of fantasy environment. So this is a sculpture that I did. This is Skerries where we live. So you can see we rarely get some snow and ice, but this was a particular one. Teddy, who's my co-founder of our group, we kind of live close to this, so we get a bit of seawater and we get a bit of condition. But that's it So this was dedicated to the tidy towns. They won the tidiest towns competition, and that's called Nacur in Irish, which is the swipes. That's it looking north, and I've done a few other things, which is this piece here is a sea memorial. So the sea memorial in Skerries, it used to be a bandstand, and there was a few fishermen that died, and everybody in the village was kind of going, well, what are we going to do? And I said, well, why don't we use the bandstand to use a Coast Guard pole where the kids can climb up the pole, and if they land or if they fall off, they can land on the bouncy rubber. And then all of these little plates here are people lost at sea. The big thing that I wanted to do was to be kind of equal to everybody, because some of the locals might have said, okay, we just want Skerries people on it, or we don't want, and I was saying, well, halfway out in the Irish Sea, there was a lot of people getting shot at from both sides in World War I, World War II, and usually the British information would say, okay, so Royal Navy boat this or Irish boat that were on the record, but then we looked up uboat.com and see how many Germans were also died. So everybody's on it, regardless of where they came from. If they died off our coast in the Irish Sea, we put a plate to them and honoured their name, regardless of who they were or what side they were on. You can see me working on the one that you saw on the ice there. That's kind of doing the finishing touches on it. And then these are some of the kind of bronze, infinity bronze sculptures that I do as well. So I'm kind of a metal worker, but that's the kids queuing up to climb on the pole. And then you're supposed to climb up to the top, touch the ball on the top, and make a wish. And you can see it meant a lot to the families who lost loved ones, because some people who never get recovered from the sea have nowhere to go. So some of them, there was a particular poignant one where a policeman had said to me, well, we've never found the body, but I think I know it's in Scotland. And he was able to relate that to the wife, saying, well, there was an unclaimed body that we think might be your husband. And it was kind of it re-engaged people in trying to find loved ones, as well as just being a place for people to go. And there was a helicopter crash there recently where the rescue helicopter was asked to go off the west of Ireland, and it banged into a lighthouse because the lighthouse was not on the maps. And the whole crew was lost, and the crew were from the East Coast. And she said, well, Shane, your memorial was the only one to have the names of my husband on it, because it took so long for them to get a memorial together. So I think anything like these memorials here are very important for people, to remember people who are lost. And in my interest in the sea, yes, this was it. So you can see all of the different flags, and you can see JCB bringing in the pole, and that's me there with Carl Duff, a local guide, the mayor of Fingal, and then in the middle is Michael D., the Irish president, at the launch of that. That was about over 10 years ago. So we got the Girl Guides and the Scouts to all have the flags, German, Norwegian, Scottish, British, Spanish. Don't think there were any Americans lost, so touch wood. It's, if you're going to come to Ireland, just don't go, be careful in the sea. This is another marine-themed one. This is Porpoise hibernicus. So just because Holland's, one of his first 6 submarines were named after the porpoise, this is a porpoise skeleton that we found off the islands off where we live. So we found this, I found this skeleton which was nearly complete, and it wasn't until we kayaked out to the island and found the other missing pieces, and it became Porpoise hibernicus. So the whole idea of how did we get into curraching was this. So we started collecting all the rubbish in our kayaks off the islands, and you can see there was 30 years of rubbish, oil tanks, and as kayakers we started cleaning up the plastic on the islands, and fishermen were throwing engine oil and all sorts of things off it, so it's pretty disgusting. You can see the dead bird there as well. So me and my friends just started collecting and then kind of counting how many that we did. So in the end, that project became the question of, we need a bigger boat. Just like in Jaws, it was like, yeah, are we going to do something? So Teddy here is in the second row. He had a garage, or you say garage, but he had, in Teddy's shed, we started building our first currach in 2018. And we did a few things wrong, and it has to come back in, but you kind of steam the ribs and chisel out the thing, and some of them are upside down because they're going into the top section. But yeah, it was a winter project, and we built our first boat. But before that, I'd worked on a boat from Donegal, which was a Torrey Island boat, which is in the northwest. It's one of the most isolated islands. But I'd done a little training course, again, back on the Boyne, where we'd rescued a boat and did it. So we attacked doing the Currach. And you can see there's a lot of clamps. We need more clamps. We steamed things using, wallpaper steamer. So, this was the first project, and I was going, well, where will building one boat lead us to? So then you can see that we met up with these wild men. I would look wild enough myself here, but this is a father and son. This is Brendan McAnowna, and these are the fellas from North Mayo. Now, this fella here is showing us a very ancient North Mayo boat, which is like a five-man salmon fishing boat off North Mayo coast. So you can see there's 16-foot oars. So they came down from Mayo and showed us how to build the oars for this one, and they brought the boat down and gave us little directions. So we ended up getting a boat that was in both Game of Thrones and the King Arthur movie, and it was down in Cork, and this guy said, we believe you guys are fixing up boats in Skerries. Can you come and look at this boat? And we said, yeah, we'll buy it. And then we ended up meeting the Mayo people and getting the instruction manual off them. So as you can see, the different styles of boats, on the right-hand side, you can see the very long navogues from Kerry. Sometimes they have a little black hole in them for an outboard motor, that can fit in, because a lot of fishermen don't have sons that are around, or people that, extra people to work with. But the Kilkee design was kind of close to ours. So this is the Hornell drawings. And the thing that I realized about Currachs is that it's very hard to get drawings of things that people who are indigenous builders, they don't really draw things down. They usually put marks on a stick, or they don't pass on the information to their, to the young people. So I actually used that boat from 1936 by James Hornell. So they were very important drawings. And then I said, well, it's very hard to see that one, but I want to draw up the drawing as a designer to make sure that we keep things on record and that we have the information for generations to come. So after drawing this up, this was our first boat. I realized then there was a guy from Washington State. He said, Shane, I realize you drew up a boat. Can I have your plans? Then another couple of Irish guys from Australia said, oh, I heard that you have a set of plans for a boat. Can we do it? So there was a boat made on a lake in Australia. And then a couple of months ago, a guy from Belfast said, oh, we heard that your drawings were, up for grabs, and we're going to set up a club over in Brisbane, Australia. So it's kind of amazing how organic things have rolled in. I also drew up, this is probably a better drawing, but this is a traditional Dunfanaghy drawing where there's hazel rods and just string to hold the boat together. So again, you have the size of the oars, 10-foot oars, big blocks on them, and just try to put all the information down. So this is the kind of work that we're doing with Currachee na Skerry, and we didn't really think it was going to be a big deal, but the club has kind of gone from having one or two boats to what's the most recent count now, Teddy? 9 boats now. We're suckers for we're suckers for building a boat. So then when the governor of Mountjoy Prison in Dublin, which is generally the fairly tough guy kind of prison in Dublin, she rang up there before Christmas and said, well, we're thinking of, we've been watching your videos from Skerries, and your community boat building kind of project is a thing. Can you do it in the prison? So I was going, well, we're going to have to look for a boat. So there was this guy, Martin Keating, and he was a West Clare man, exactly from where Holland came from, on the very end of that peninsula, and he had brought his boat to the east of the country, down at Rosslare in the southeast. And he had a boat in a shed for the last maybe 25 years, and he put it up on one of the auction sites, and I saw the boat, and I rang the governor and said, I've got the boat. Got off the ferry one of the times, and he had rowed the boat kind of in the 70s and 80s down in Rosslare with his brother-in-laws, and that was the condition we got it in. So it was pretty roughed up, and that's, you can see that's it on my van there backing into the gates of the prison. So again, I was pretty stressed out about the whole idea of working with fellas in a prison when I'm bringing my Stanley knives and all my sharp tools and all my chisels and going, am I going to get a chisel in the back here from these guys? But they were all over 55. They'd all got good behavior. They'd all said, we're not going to steal your tools, because if we screw up and mess you about, we're going to end up in the other side of the prison, which was not the training unit, not the fancy side. So these guys were in the fancy side, where they had a lot to lose if they messed with me. So that was the start of the prison project. So this is the most recent one. So you can see it went from this to this. So the prisoners helped me build this boat, and it was just launched there a couple of weeks ago on the Liffey in Dublin at the Garda Boat Club, which is like the police rowing club. And the blue and white is the colour of County Clare. So you can see that Splodar was a kind of we gave it a name, joy and excitement, and all the people that used to row the boat came up for the launch, and it was like a very, it was a very kind of inspiring thing for me to be involved with, but also for the people that thought that their boat would never see the water again, and it floated. So we were delighted with that, and that's the chief prison officer, two of the prison guys. Now, unfortunately, the prisoners weren't allowed out for the occasion, because they were kind of saying, okay, this could be pretty tricky for the press, and they'd say, oh, taxpayers' money is paying for these guys to be rowing up and down the Liffey, and that's it. So, but we made a plate, and we got it out on the water and tried to train in this. So this boat has gone to be a thing for young offenders or people who get in a brush with the law. They're not in custodial sentences, but this boat has gone back to be a training vessel for kids in Dublin that kind of need to get back on track. And I thought that the discipline of rowing is the ideal kind of scenario for people. So we're kind of training in these trainers to get them in the boat and encourage kids to get in the boat. So that's the kind of the conclusion. And you're probably very glad that it does have a start and an end, and I'm going to encourage questions and answers and all that. And I didn't talk about my grandfather yet, but in conclusion, I suppose the stories are many. Life is short, do what you can do, particularly with your communities. So any community projects you can see, the AOH, the New London Rowers, the Holland Club, any of the people that want to make a difference in your community, just get involved. Just do what you feel like you should do, and don't be afraid of failure. Do what feels right. And again, I suppose the whole respect earns respect, specifically in the prison, because I was very worried about going into a prison environment and saying, what's going to happen here? And in the end, I didn't really depend on the prison officers to kind of look after me. They said, oh, listen, grow up, you've got to deal with these guys. And I ended up kind of going to the prisoners' canteen with them rather than going to the staff canteen, because they were going, Shane, do you want to go for a cup of tea? So if you give the prisoners respect, they will see it immediately. If you don't respect them, they will probably jump on top of you. So again, the respect thing is a huge thing in terms of boating, and in terms of discipline and trying to be nice to people. So I suppose Holland had to build it and they will come. It's a motto of anybody who kind of sticks their nose out. And so Slán Liv Golair, that's goodbye, and Gur Mahigut is thank you to Groton, New London, and Paterson, New Jersey is tomorrow. So I'll take any questions now. Thank you very much.
What's the overall length of your sculpture, the Submarine?
It's about 12 foot long. 12 feet. Yeah, it's about 12 feet, and it's about, it's about 120 pounds in terms of, so it's for sale, by the way, and it can come to the US. $40,000 will do it, plus shipping. So I hope that answers that one.
And 5,000 to bring it over.
Yeah, well, that's 45, yeah.
I didn't hear you mention anything about the Holland torpedo boat facility in Long Island, in New Suffolk. There was a,
Yeah.
which was probably the most important chapter in Holland's
History.
submarine history.
Yeah.
As I understand it, although the Holland was built in New Jersey,
Yeah.
Holland came to the conclusion he couldn't do very secretive sea trials in the Hudson River. So he,
Yeah, well,
so he acquired land on the North Fork of Long Island on the south side, just north of Robben Island, in a harbor called Cutchogue Harbor.
okay.
And that's where I think about 10 of the Holland-class submarines were built after the Holland itself. And in fact, that's where the men were trained to operate these submarines and so forth. And in his authoritative book on submarines, Admiral Crowe calls New Suffolk, in essence, the nation's first submarine base.
Okay.
And there are all sorts of historical markers there. I don't know if you've ever been to New Suffolk.
No, I haven't.
Well, you may want to try going there sometime.
Okay.
Because even the ruins of the Holland factory were still there in the early 90s. I don't know if they're there today. But I discovered them quite by accident as a sailor, because I wound up putting my sailboat in one of the submarine pens one night.
Wow.
Because they were abandoned, you know.
Okay.
But
Well, I think there were a lot of sites. I think there was the plunger was down in Baltimore, and then there was other, they were always moving around to different boat yards trying to get the best deal to build either the 1, 2, 3, 4, and I think the business did move up to New Suffolk. Yeah.
The boats were actually built in New Suffolk, and Holland had a facility there. Of course, they went around other places after they were constructed, but and the U.S. government didn't have much interest in submarines at that time.
Correct.
Holland had a shore selling the Holland 1 U.S. to the government.
I think it was 7 years.
Yeah, yeah.
It was a short decision of 7 years, yeah.
Battle, and I know he also made submarines for that were sold to the Russians and to Peru and other countries, because the U.S. didn't have any real interest in submarines back at that time.
He had a tough job with the U.S. Navy, that's for sure. There was no love lost, and I think when the design kind of went beyond his control, then the people down in the new naval architects started fiddling around with the design, and he was going crazy, saying, "Oh, they're going to mess it up." And same with the Royal Navy when they got it. Their designers were working on it, but there were multiple boat yards and multiple facilities. But in New York Harbor, as you say, there were British spies watching what's going on, and they were given out to Washington saying, "What's this guy doing?" And they said, "It doesn't matter. He's just a crazy guy experimenting, so don't worry about it."
Holland was really a pioneer in terms of the submarine. Yeah, but there were other people that made submarines, but they never got very far with them. And then, of course, the Holland Torpedo Boat Company was purchased somewhere around 1900 by Electric Boat.
Yes.
And but no submarines came to Groton before 1914.
Yeah, so it was later on.
Yeah. So New Suffolk was in essence as according to Admiral Crowe, the nation's first submarine base.
Correct. Well, thank you for that. That's filling the gaps in there. Thank you. Anybody else? The gentleman here?
It's one of the pictures you had showed a currach that was round. Right?
Yes.
It looks like a pot. So
Yeah.
would people wind up rowing in circles or what? You didn't have a draw.
Yeah, well, that's a river boat. So the guy can kind of spin around, and it's got a paddle. So if you're on a river, you can hit rapids, you can slide down the rapids. So even on whitewater, They were essentially usually a large bullock with like maybe, eighth of an inch or, nearly quarter of an inch skin. So it was quite tough, and you could roll it over the rocks and you could spin it around. So it was only really for getting across a river, and it wasn't really a big one. So in Wales they have them, they called coracles, but in Ireland we prefer calling them Boyne Currachs. And it was it was just hazelwood wrapped up and then skin. It was actually skin mostly, and then some of the modern ones have canvas on them.
I was surprised that you're calling them a currach as well. They're cockles, a cockle shell, sort of a thing. Question on the boats.
Yeah.
You showed me two very different style boats in terms of the currach.
Yeah.
And there's the clear and then another blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Are the differences mainly the builder, or is it the area that they're going to be used?
Kind of the area. Like if you took the west coast of Ireland, I don't have a map of it at the moment, but you start in Donegal, there's about 4 or 5. So there's the Torrey Island one, Dunfanaghy, the Fanad, so the 3 at least in Donegal. Then you go down to Mayo and you've got the Belderrig one, which was showing you with those guys. That's a salmon fishing North Atlantic one, which is a 25-foot boat. Then you go into the Inishkees. Then you have the Achill Island have a different one. So almost every stretch of the coast has a different one. The Galway people, the Aran Islands have a different one, and they've different shear on the bow then to hit the waves. So, and like maybe the American boats, because the Curragh racing fraternity is more on rivers, they don't have the high bow. So the one that you have out here is kind of more of a flat one. But we right around the west coast, right to Kerry, have a lot of different setups, and everybody's constantly, tweaking it and changing it. But down in the southwest, the Navogues are kind of the closest to what the American rowers are rowing at the moment, which is 4 in a row, 4 men or women in a row, and that's a 25-foot boat.
So I was thinking that the West Country is a pretty energetic area offshore, and you might have a very different style boat than you would have in Dublin, the East Country, say.
Yeah.
But it sounds like it's more the builder tweaking as you come down the coast, right?
Well, some people complain about you tweaking, and then the traditionalists would go, "Oh, you shouldn't have done it that way." But in our setup, we're on the East Coast, so there's not a tradition. But what I didn't really mention about my family is that they left Cork in the economic war in the 30s. They left the land because there was an economic war with Britain and they couldn't sell their agricultural produce. So my grandfather moved up to Mayo and Sligo. So they moved up to the west. And then, so my dad is from Mayo, and then they moved back down to the east. So the Hollands have been moving around the country for a long time, but we have set up a club in a part of the east coast that's more wooden boats, not curraghs. But it was more that there's a lot of west of Ireland people that have moved to the east coast, and we're rejuvenating the culture. Yeah. Yeah.
What kind of skins did you use?
Well, traditionally in the St. Brendan was using cowhides and skins. So that the original boats that the Irish would have gone to, even, they were boats found in Greenland, they were skin boats with tallow and wax to kind of seal up the gaps. Then, as I said, the Coast Guard kind of started this whole thing of using canvas in the 19th century and promoting calico and then tarring over it with bitumen. So that would be the kind of, we did that on the prison boat. We did a canvas, which is just cotton canvas, 12-ounce duck canvas, and then tarred. But in some of our boats where we've a lot of rocks and skerries, we're using ballistic nylon, which is like the stuff you have on suitcases or on the knee pads for Snickers kind of workwear. So we're using ballistic nylon now, and then the guys in the west coast, some of the Connemara men they're just using fiberglass because again, it's got more of a chance if you pull it, if you run it on the rocks. So yeah, that's 4 different types. Anybody else?
So do
Fred.
you live in Skerries now?
That's right. Yeah.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, we do, and
You're very familiar with Dragon, right?
yeah, it's called after the rocks. The Vikings called Skerry the rocks. So we have pretty pointy rocks to avoid, and you're only a half a millimeter from meeting your maker if you slice it open. Yeah. Yeah.
A couple other points on those early submarines. Teddy Roosevelt was the first president to go on a submarine.
Okay.
And he went on one of the submarines based in New Suffolk on Long Island, one of the
Okay.
early Holland class. I don't remember which one.
Yeah.
But of course, New Suffolk was never a place that could accommodate submarines like we do here in Groton, because Cutchogue Harbor is only 14 feet deep.
Okay.
And it's a long ways out to
Okay.
the Atlantic
Right.
there.
Yeah.
And of course, technology has changed so much. Those submarines were, I believe, powered by gasoline engines or diesel.
Yeah.
And there were fumes, so they had mice on the submarines. When the mice started to die, it was time
You
to
knew it was
surface.
trouble. Yeah. Well, I think there was a Brayson engine, was the petroleum engine that was kind of favored after steam. I think it was the plunger, which was the Navy, the troublesome one, which is called the Zelensky boat, and they were forcing them to use steam, and then the boat was too hot for the people in the boat, and then they moved to a gasoline engine, which was a Brayson engine. But I think then there was an Otto engine, which was, and Teddy is an Otto, and I think they then moved to diesel and batteries. Diesel for propulsion on the surface and batteries for propulsion underneath the surface.
Of course, those boats were only about 40, 50 feet long initially, the early Holland submarine.
Yeah, well, some of the, maybe the Fenian Ram was only about that, maybe 30, 40 feet. I think it went to 76 feet long in the first ones commissioned by the Navy.
Far from what we have today.
Oh yeah, they're big. I think the guy was, the fellow that was talking to us today was close to 500 feet long, yeah. So listen, if anybody else has any questions, I'd like to take them, or otherwise we can kind of wrap it up. But I'm really delighted that you could all make it here today. I'm really also very happy of the support of the new London Rowers, the AOH, and the library here as well, that they've given us excellent facilities. If it wasn't touching their brand new screens. But listen, I'm delighted with the turnout, and really delighted to be in New London, which is, as they say, the submarine capital of the world. So thank you for coming.